My name is Claire Mitchell, and for most of my life, I was the relative nobody expected much from. I was 38 years old, divorced, and working as an office administrator for a small logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid my bills, kept a roof over my head, and allowed me to live independently. According to my family, though, that wasn't enough. You see, the Mitchell family had become surprisingly wealthy over the years. My uncle Richard owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. His son, Ethan, worked in private equity in Chicago and seemed to make more money in a month than I made in a year. My cousin Vanessa was a successful real estate broker in Florida. Another cousin had founded a tech startup that was later sold for millions. And then there was me. The woman who drove an 8-year-old Toyota. The woman who still rented an apartment instead of owning a home. The woman who wasn't considered a success. Every family gathering felt like an unspoken competition, and I wasn't even allowed on the scoreboard. The worst part wasn't that they were wealthy. The worst part was that they made sure everyone knew it. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday party, or summer barbecue turned into a showcase of luxury lifestyles. Someone would be talking about a new vacation home in Colorado. Someone else would mention a European river cruise. Then another relative would casually bring up a luxury SUV they had just purchased. The conversations always seemed designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood in the family hierarchy. And I always stood at the bottom. One Saturday afternoon in July, our family gathered at my Uncle Richard's sprawling estate outside Cincinnati. Calling it a house felt ridiculous. It looked more like a private resort. The driveway curved around a fountain large enough to belong in a hotel lobby. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Mercedes, BMWs, Range Rovers. As I pulled up in my aging Toyota, I noticed several relatives glancing in my direction. I pretended not to notice. I had gotten good at that over the years. Inside, groups of family members mingled around the massive backyard pool. My cousin Ethan was showing people photos from a recent trip to Monaco. Vanessa was discussing a beachfront property she had just purchased. Everywhere I turned, someone was talking about money. I grabbed a glass of lemonade and found a quiet spot near the patio. For about 10 minutes, I managed to stay invisible. Then Ethan spotted me. "Claire!" He called loudly. Several heads turned. I forced a smile. "Hey, Ethan." He walked over with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "So how's work going?" he asked. The question sounded innocent. It never was. "It's going well." "What exactly do you do again?" I knew he knew the answer. He asked every time. "I'm an office administrator." He nodded slowly. "Right." That single word carried more judgment than an entire speech. Nearby relatives listened while pretending not to. Ethan smiled. "You ever think about moving into something with more growth potential?" A few people laughed softly. I shrugged. "I'm happy where I am." "That's good," he said. "Not everyone is built for high-pressure careers." The comment landed exactly as intended. A subtle insult disguised as concern. I looked away and sipped my drink. The conversation eventually shifted elsewhere, but the damage had already been done. It always was. Later that evening, everyone gathered for dinner under a large covered patio. The table seemed endless. Dozens of family members filled the seats. For a while, things remained pleasant. Then Uncle Richard stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass. "I just want to say how proud I am of everything this family has accomplished." Everyone cheered. He began listing achievements. New businesses. Promotions. Investments. Property purchases. One by one, he praised various relatives. Then his eyes landed on me. A familiar smile appeared. The kind that always made me uncomfortable. "And Claire," he said. The table grew quiet. "I admire your consistency." A few people chuckled. I felt my stomach tighten. Uncle Richard continued. "Not everyone has grand ambitions, and that's okay." More laughter. Several relatives looked down at their plates. Others smiled awkwardly. I sat frozen in my chair. Then came the comment that everyone would remember. Richard lifted his glass again and said, "Every successful family needs at least one person who reminds the rest of us how far we've come." The table erupted with laughter. Not everyone laughed. But enough did. Enough to make it hurt. I felt my face burning. For a moment, I considered defending myself. Saying something. Anything. Instead, I simply stood up. I quietly placed my napkin on the table. And walked away. Behind me, the laughter slowly faded. No one stopped me. No one followed me. As I crossed the enormous front lawn toward my car, I looked back at the glowing mansion filled with smiling relatives. For years, I had believed that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed kind enough, if I proved myself worthy enough, they would eventually respect me. That night, standing alone beside my old Toyota, I realized something important. They had already decided who I was. And no amount of explaining would ever change their minds. What I didn't know then was that the people laughing around that dinner table were about to witness something none of them expected. Because the woman they considered the family disappointment was about to make a decision that would change the course of her life forever. And one day, every single person at that table would wish they had treated her differently. For the next few months, I stayed away from family events whenever I could. After what happened at Uncle Richard's summer gathering, I told myself I needed some distance. Not because I was angry. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The truth was much harder to admit. I was embarrassed. Embarrassed that I had spent years trying to earn respect from people who seemed determined to withhold it. Embarrassed that their words still affected me. Most of all, embarrassed that a part of me still wanted their approval. Life returned to its usual routine. Work. Bills. Groceries. Quiet evenings alone. Nothing glamorous. Nothing anyone in my family would consider impressive. Then November arrived. And with it came Thanksgiving. My mother called me 2 weeks before the holiday. "You're coming this year, right?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know." There was silence on the other end. "Claire, I know things have been difficult, but avoiding everyone won't solve anything." I stared out my apartment window. Maybe she was right. Maybe I needed to stop hiding. Maybe one awkward dinner wasn't worth creating a family feud. So I agreed to go. A decision I would regret almost immediately. Thanksgiving dinner was being hosted at Ethan's newly purchased home outside Chicago. Of course it was. The house had 6 bedrooms, a home theater, and a backyard larger than my entire apartment complex. As I pulled into the driveway, luxury vehicles lined both sides of the property. BMWs, Teslas. Mercedes. A brand new Porsche. My Toyota looked completely out of place. Just like me. Inside, relatives filled every room. The smell of turkey and fresh-baked pies drifted through the house. People laughed and exchanged stories. At first, everything seemed normal. Then the questions started. They always did. I had barely finished my first plate when Aunt Linda sat beside me. "So Claire," she said. "Here we go. How's work?" "Good. You still at that office job?" "Yes." She smiled politely. The kind of smile people use when discussing unfortunate circumstances. "Well, as long as you're happy." A few minutes later another relative joined the conversation. Then another. Soon I felt like I was being interviewed. Any plans to buy a house? No. Thinking about going back to school? Not really. Ever considered starting a business? No. Each answer seemed to disappoint them. As if my life existed solely as a cautionary tale. Across the table, Ethan discussed investment opportunities. People listened carefully. His opinions mattered. Mine never seemed to. Then Uncle Richard arrived carrying a glass of wine. The moment I saw him walking toward the table, I felt my stomach tighten. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Claire. Uncle Richard. He nodded. Then came the question. So tell me. I already knew what was coming. How much are they paying office administrators these days? The table became unusually quiet. I hated that question. Not because I was ashamed of my income, but because he never asked out of genuine curiosity. I gave him a vague answer. I do okay. Richard laughed. That bad, huh? Several cousins smiled. I forced a laugh. Inside, I wanted to disappear. Then Richard leaned back. Don't get me wrong. Whenever someone started a sentence that way, they absolutely meant to get you wrong. There's nothing wrong with honest work. A few relatives nodded. But I always tell people ambition matters. He pointed toward Ethan. Look at him. Then toward Vanessa. Look at her. Finally, he turned back to me. Some people build wealth. The room grew quieter. Others spend their lives helping successful people stay organized. A few cousins burst into laughter. Not loud. Not cruel. But loud enough. I recognized one of them. My cousin Tyler. The same cousin who used to borrow money from his parents every month. Yet somehow he found my situation funny. I looked around the table. Some relatives avoided eye contact. Others smiled awkwardly. Nobody challenged Richard. Nobody defended me. Because that was how it had always been. In their minds, he wasn't being rude. He was simply stating facts. The family success stories sat on one side of the invisible line. And I sat on the other. The disappointment. The underachiever. The woman who never quite measured up. The rest of dinner became a blur. I smiled when expected. Answered questions when necessary. Pretended everything was fine. Inside, I felt exhausted. By the time dessert was served, I couldn't wait to leave. I quietly grabbed my coat and purse. My mother noticed. Leaving already? I nodded. I've got a long drive tomorrow. She looked disappointed but didn't stop me. Maybe she understood. Maybe she had seen enough. Outside, the cold November air hit my face. For a moment, I stood alone beside my car. The laughter from inside the house drifted through the windows. A warm family gathering. At least for everyone else. I sat behind the wheel and stared at the steering wheel for several minutes. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream. Instead, I thought about every comment. Every joke. Every comparison. Every moment I'd spent feeling smaller than everyone around me. And for the first time, something changed. Not anger. Not sadness. Determination. A quiet, steady determination. Because suddenly I realized something. My relatives had spent years deciding who I was. But they had never once asked who I wanted to become. As snowflakes began falling onto the windshield, I started the engine. Then I made a promise to myself. The next chapter of my life would not be written by Uncle Richard. Or Ethan. Or anyone sitting around that dinner table. It would be written by me. And whether they ever respected me or not, I was finally going to give myself a reason to be proud. The drive home from Chicago took nearly 6 hours. Most of that time, I drove in silence. No music. No podcasts. Just the hum of the highway and my own thoughts. I kept replaying Thanksgiving dinner in my head. Uncle Richard's comments. The laughter. The pitying looks. For years, I had convinced myself that if I worked harder, smiled more, and stayed patient, eventually my family would respect me. But somewhere on that long drive home, I finally accepted a truth I had been avoiding. They weren't waiting for me to prove myself. They had already decided who I was. And no amount of explaining was going to change their minds. When I unlocked the door to my apartment that night, I walked straight to my kitchen table and sat down. The apartment was quiet. No family. No judgment. No comparisons. Just me. For the first time in years, I asked myself a simple question. If nobody's approval mattered, what would I actually want? The answer surprised me. Freedom. Not luxury. Not mansions. Not expensive cars. Freedom. The freedom to choose my life without worrying about what anyone thought. The freedom to never feel trapped by a paycheck again. The freedom to stop being the family disappointment. That night, I made a decision. A decision I told absolutely no one about. Not even my mother. A few months earlier, one of the managers at work had mentioned something called digital project management. At the time, I barely paid attention. But now I started researching it. The more I learned, the more interested I became. Companies were hiring remote project managers. Businesses needed people who could organize teams, manage deadlines, and solve problems. And strangely enough, those were skills I already used every day. For years, I had coordinated schedules, handled logistics, organized operations, and kept an office running smoothly. Maybe my job wasn't glamorous, but it had taught me valuable skills. For the first time, I began seeing my experience differently. Maybe I wasn't behind. Maybe I was simply standing at a different starting line. So I enrolled in online courses. Every evening after work, I came home, made dinner, and sat at my laptop. 6 o'clock. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. Sometimes midnight. Sometimes later. While other people watched television, I studied. While my cousins posted vacation photos on social media, I completed certifications. While my relatives slept comfortably in their expensive homes, I sat at my tiny kitchen table learning everything I could. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't glamorous. Most nights, it was exhausting. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward. The first person I told was my friend Melissa. We had worked together for nearly 10 years. One afternoon during lunch, I mentioned what I was doing. She smiled. "Claire, that's actually smart." "You think so?" "I know so." I laughed. "You're probably the only person who does." Melissa shook her head. "Then stop asking those people for permission." Her words stayed with me. Because she was right. I had spent so much time worrying about what my family thought that I had forgotten something important. Successful people don't wait for approval. They create opportunities. Unfortunately, my family didn't see it that way. A few months later, my mother accidentally mentioned my courses during a family phone call. Within days, the news had spread. At Easter, I discovered everyone knew. I arrived at my aunt's house carrying a dessert. Before I even reached the dining room, I heard Ethan's voice. "So I hear you're becoming a business expert now." Several relatives laughed. I forced a smile. "It's just professional development." Professional development. Tyler grinned. What does that even mean? I explained the certification program. Halfway through, I could already see their eyes glazing over. They weren't interested. They had already decided the outcome. Vanessa smiled politely. Well, it's nice that you're staying busy. Staying busy. As if I had taken up knitting. As if I wasn't spending hundreds of hours learning new skills. As if my future were simply a hobby. Then Uncle Richard joined the conversation. Claire. I turned toward him. He smiled. I admire your optimism. There it was again. That familiar tone. The one that sounded supportive until you listened carefully. But let's be realistic. Several relatives nodded. You don't suddenly become successful at 38 because you take a few online classes. The room filled with quiet laughter. I smiled politely. But something had changed. For once, his words didn't hurt. Because unlike before, I wasn't trying to convince him anymore. I wasn't trying to convince any of them. The truth was, they didn't know how many hours I had spent studying. They didn't know how hard I was working. They didn't know about the certifications. The networking. The plans. The goals. And for the first time in my life, I liked it that way. Over the next year, my routine became relentless. Work. Study. Learn. Repeat. Weekends disappeared. Vacations disappeared. Late nights became normal. There were moments when I questioned everything. Moments when I wondered if Uncle Richard was right. Maybe I was too old. Maybe I had missed my chance. Maybe my family saw something I didn't. But every time doubt appeared, I remembered Thanksgiving. I remembered the laughter. And I kept going. One step at a time. One course at a time. One skill at a time. Because I wasn't doing this to impress my family anymore. I was doing it for myself. And although nobody around me realized it, the woman they still viewed as the family disappointment was quietly building something they would never see coming. The next 3 years passed differently than any period of my life before. I stopped trying to be part of every family gathering. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. I simply realized that every hour I spent sitting at a table where people judged me was an hour I could spend building a better future. So when invitations arrived, I politely declined. Christmas. Summer barbecues. Birthday parties. Family reunions. One by one, I stopped showing up. At first, relatives noticed. Then they joked about it. Eventually, they stopped asking. To them, I had become the quiet cousin who disappeared. The cousin whose life was apparently too boring to discuss. What they didn't know was that those years would become the most important years of my life. Every morning, I woke up at 5:30. I studied before work. Worked a full day. Then came home and studied some more. The certifications eventually turned into freelance projects. The freelance projects turned into small contracts. The contracts led to opportunities one never imagined possible. But success wasn't happening nearly as fast as motivational videos promised. Most months felt like failure. I remember landing my first independent consulting project. I was thrilled. After taxes and expenses, I made less than $200. $200. 4 weeks of effort. I sat at my kitchen table staring at my bank account and wondering if I was completely delusional. Maybe Uncle Richard had been right. Maybe I was chasing something that wasn't meant for me. Then things got worse. A lot worse. One spring morning, the logistics company where I had worked for nearly 13 years announced major restructuring. Several positions were eliminated. Mine was one of them. Just like that, I was unemployed. I remember sitting in my car after the meeting. My cardboard box filled with personal belongings sat in the passenger seat. A coffee mug. A framed photo. A few notebooks. 13 years of loyalty reduced to a cardboard box. I drove home in silence. The same silence that had followed me after Thanksgiving years earlier. Except this time, the fear felt heavier. I had rent to pay. Bills. Insurance. Groceries. And now no paycheck. That night, I opened my laptop and looked at my savings account. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. For the first time in years, panic began creeping into my mind. The following months tested me more than anything before. I applied for jobs. Some never responded. Others rejected me. A few interviews went nowhere. Meanwhile, my savings kept shrinking. I cut expenses everywhere. No restaurants. No vacations. No unnecessary purchases. I sold furniture. Canceled subscriptions. Started tracking every dollar. There were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling until 3 in the morning. Wondering how much longer I could keep going. Wondering whether I should abandon everything and start over. The dream that had once felt exciting now felt terrifying. One evening, after receiving another rejection email, I finally broke. I sat alone at my kitchen table and cried. Not because of that single rejection. Because of all of it. The years. The sacrifices. The uncertainty. The loneliness. I had spent so much time proving everyone wrong that I never stopped to ask whether I could actually succeed. For the first time, quitting seemed reasonable. Maybe I should accept reality. Maybe some people simply weren't meant to achieve more. Maybe I had wasted years chasing an impossible future. I closed my laptop. Walked into my bedroom. And seriously considered giving up. The next morning, something unexpected happened. I received an email. Not a job offer. Not a contract. Just a message from a former client. A small business owner I had helped months earlier. The email was short. Claire, your work made a bigger difference than you probably realize. We're growing because of systems you helped create. Thank you. That was it. A simple message. Most people would have forgotten it within minutes. I couldn't. Because for months, I had measured progress only by money. For the first time, someone reminded me that I was actually helping people. That my work mattered. That I mattered. I didn't quit. Instead, I opened my laptop again. I updated my resume. Sent more applications. Reached out to more contacts. Took more courses. Applied for more projects. And slowly, almost painfully slowly, things began moving forward. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Just enough to keep going. One small win. Then another. Then another. The road remained difficult. But the hopelessness began fading. Meanwhile, my family knew almost nothing about my life. Occasionally, my mother would mention that I was busy with work. Most relatives barely seemed interested. In their minds, I was still the same Claire. The office administrator. The cousin who never accomplished much. The woman who disappeared from family gatherings. And honestly, that was fine with me. Because while they were busy maintaining the version of me they had created years earlier, I was becoming someone entirely different. Someone stronger. Someone more confident. Someone who no longer needed their approval. I just didn't realize yet how close I was to the breakthrough that would change everything. By the beginning of my 42nd year, I had stopped expecting miracles. That may sound strange, but it was true. After years of setbacks, Rejection emails, financial stress, and long nights spent questioning my decisions, I no longer woke up hoping for some life-changing opportunity. Instead, I focused on the next task. The next client. The next project. The next day. And maybe that's why the breakthrough caught me completely by surprise. It started with a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my apartment, working on a small consulting project, when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar. Normally, I would have ignored it. For some reason, I answered. Hello. A woman introduced herself as the operations director of a rapidly growing logistics company based in Texas. At first, I thought she had the wrong number. Then she explained. One of my former clients had recommended me. Apparently, word had spread. Several business owners I had worked with had been discussing the improvements I helped implement in their companies. My name kept coming up. The woman explained that her company was struggling with expansion. Deadlines were being missed. Communication problems were growing. Processes were breaking down. They needed someone to help organize operations. And they wanted to speak with me. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the wall. For nearly 5 minutes, I didn't move. Because for the first time in years, an opportunity had found me. I hadn't chased it. I hadn't begged for it. I hadn't applied for it. It had arrived because of the work I had already done. 2 weeks later, I flew to Dallas for a series of meetings. I remember feeling completely out of place. The company's headquarters occupied an entire floor of a downtown office tower. Executives in expensive suits moved through glass conference rooms. Everything looked polished and intimidating. Meanwhile, I was still carrying the same laptop bag I had owned for years. Part of me felt like an imposter. But another part of me remembered something important. I knew what I was doing. I had earned my seat at that table. The meetings lasted 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, they presented me with an offer. A major consulting contract. The largest opportunity of my career. I looked at the numbers 3 times because I genuinely thought there had been a mistake. The contract was worth more money than I had earned in several years at my old office job. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The operations director smiled. We believe you're the right person for this. I signed the agreement that afternoon. Then I walked outside and sat alone on a bench. The Dallas skyline stretched above me. People hurried past. Cars moved through the streets. Life continued normally. Yet my entire future had just changed. The following year transformed everything. The project succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The company expanded efficiently. Productivity improved. Costs decreased. New opportunities followed. More referrals arrived. Then larger contracts. Then larger clients. Soon I wasn't chasing work anymore. Work was finding me. For years, I had struggled to convince people I had value. Now companies were competing for my time. The irony wasn't lost on me. Financial stability arrived gradually. Not overnight. Not through some lucky lottery ticket. Through years of effort finally producing results. The first thing I did wasn't buy a luxury car. I didn't purchase designer clothes. I didn't move into a mansion. Instead, I paid off every debt. Every single one. I still remember the feeling. Years of financial pressure simply disappeared. For the first time since my 20s, I could breathe. A few months later, I purchased a modest home. Nothing extravagant. Just a comfortable place that belonged to me. When I received the keys, I sat in the empty living room and cried. Not because the house was impressive. Because it represented something much bigger. Security. Freedom. Proof that I hadn't given up. What surprised me most was how little I wanted to show it off. For years, I had imagined what success might feel like. I assumed I would want everyone to know. I assumed I would finally prove my family wrong. Instead, something unexpected happened. I stopped caring. The approval I had chased for decades no longer seemed important. I didn't post pictures online. I didn't announce my achievements. I didn't call relatives to update them. Most of them had no idea what was happening. And honestly, I preferred it that way. Success felt different than I expected. Quieter. Calmer. More personal. It wasn't about making other people jealous. It was about waking up every morning without fear. One evening, while organizing paperwork in my home office, I found an old notebook. Inside were notes from years earlier. Goals. Plans. Ideas. Doubts. I flipped through page after page. Then I found a sentence I had written shortly after that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner. The handwriting was shaky. The words simple. One day, I want to be proud of myself, even if nobody else is. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then I smiled. Because somewhere along the way, that goal had already been achieved. Long before the money. Long before the contracts. Long before the success. The real victory had happened the moment I stopped seeking permission to believe in myself. What I didn't know was that my family's ignorance was about to end. Because after years of silence, an invitation was about to arrive. And when I walked back into their world, they would discover that the cousin they had spent years mocking no longer existed. By the spring of my 43rd year, life had become something I barely recognized. Not because I was wealthy. Not because I had suddenly become important. But because the constant anxiety that used to follow me everywhere was gone. I slept better. I smiled more. I no longer checked my bank account with dread. And perhaps most importantly, I had stopped measuring my worth against other people's opinions. The irony was that after spending years wanting my family's respect, I hardly thought about them anymore. Then one afternoon, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. The return address immediately caught my attention. Mitchell family. I already knew what it was before I opened it. A wedding invitation. My cousin Tyler was getting married. I couldn't help but laugh. Of all my cousins, Tyler was the last person I expected to settle down. Growing up, he had always been the life of every party. The cousin who spent money faster than he earned it. The same cousin who used to laugh whenever Uncle Richard made jokes about me. Now he was getting married at a luxury resort in Napa Valley. Of course he was. Everything in our family seemed to involve money. The invitation looked more like an award certificate than a wedding announcement. Gold lettering. Multiple event schedules. A weekend-long celebration. Private vineyard tours. Formal dinners. A black tie reception. I could practically hear Uncle Richard bragging about it already. I placed the invitation on the kitchen counter and walked away. For several days, I ignored it. The RSVP deadline approached. Still, I couldn't decide. Part of me wanted to decline. Life was peaceful now. Why voluntarily walk back into a room filled with people who had spent years looking down on me? What exactly was I supposed to gain? I already knew how the weekend would unfold. The same conversations. The same assumptions. The same awkward smiles. Most of my relatives hadn't seen me in years. As far as they knew, I was still struggling. Still trying to find myself. Still taking online courses. Still the family disappointment. I could already imagine the questions. Still doing consulting. How's that little business going? Are you finally making enough to survive? I laughed just thinking about it. If they only knew. But that wasn't the point. I didn't need them to know. A week later, my mother called. "Did you RSVP yet?" "No." "You're thinking about skipping it?" It wasn't a question. I smiled. "You know me too well." She sighed. "Claire, it's been years." "I know. You can't avoid family forever." I walked toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something unexpected. "You know, they're probably expecting the old Claire to show up." I laughed softly. "Exactly. No." My mother's voice became gentle. "That's exactly why you should go." The words stayed with me long after the call ended. Because she was right. Not about proving anything. Not about showing off. About something much simpler. The old Claire no longer existed. The woman who spent every family gathering feeling inferior was gone. The woman who needed approval was gone. The woman who measured her value against her cousins was gone. Maybe it was time to see if I truly believed that. A few days later, I mailed my RSVP. Attending. The moment the envelope disappeared into the mailbox, I felt strangely nervous. Not because of the wedding. Because I knew what waited for me there. The past. For years, I had built a new life. A stronger life. But the Mitchell family had always had a way of pulling me back into old versions of myself. I wondered if this time would be different. As the wedding weekend approached, family group messages became increasingly active. Photos of the resort circulated. Discussions about flights. Hotel reservations. Formal attire. One evening, I noticed a conversation between several cousins. Tyler jokingly wrote, "Hopefully Claire actually shows up this time." Someone responded with a laughing emoji. Then another cousin replied, "Maybe she's busy saving the corporate world." More laughter followed. I stared at the messages for a moment. Then set my phone down. Years earlier, comments like that would have ruined my evening. Now they barely registered. Because while they were still laughing at the person they thought I was, I had spent years becoming someone they didn't know. The morning of the wedding weekend finally arrived. I packed a suitcase and loaded it into my car. As I closed the trunk, I paused for a moment. Part of me still questioned the decision. I could turn around. Stay home. Avoid the drama. Avoid the awkward conversations. Avoid the memories. Instead, I climbed into the driver's seat. Started the engine. And began the drive to Napa Valley. What I didn't know was that this wedding would become the most unforgettable family gathering of my life. Because before the weekend was over, a secret I had kept hidden for years would finally come to light. And the relatives who once laughed at me would be left speechless. The drive into Napa Valley was beautiful. Rolling hills stretched across the horizon. Vineyards covered the landscape in neat rows. The setting sun painted the hills in shades of gold and orange. It looked like something from a postcard. The wedding resort itself was even more impressive. Luxury cottages surrounded a massive vineyard. Elegant stone buildings overlooked the valley. Guests in expensive clothing moved between cocktail lounges and outdoor terraces. The kind of place my family loved. The kind of place where appearances mattered. I parked my car, checked into my room, and spent a few quiet minutes preparing myself. Not for the wedding. For the family. Because I knew the moment I walked into that welcome reception, the assumptions would begin. And I was right. The reception was being held in a large outdoor courtyard overlooking the vineyards. String lights hung overhead. Music played softly in the background. Servers carried trays of drinks through the crowd. I had barely stepped through the entrance when I heard a familiar voice. "Claire." I turned. Vanessa. My cousin looked genuinely surprised. Wow, she said. You actually came. I laughed politely. Good to see you too. She hugged me quickly. Then immediately asked the question I expected. So what have you been up to these past few years? There it was. The question. Not because she wanted to know. Because she assumed the answer wouldn't be very interesting. Work mostly. She nodded. Still consulting? Yes. Oh. Her expression said everything. Consulting sounded vague. Unimpressive. Certainly not something worth discussing. Within seconds, her attention shifted toward another conversation. I smiled. Some things never changed. Over the next hour, the same pattern repeated itself. Relative after relative approached me. Every conversation followed nearly the same script. Still living in Ohio? Yep. Still working independently? Yes. Business going okay? It's going well. That's nice. Always the same response. That's nice. The phrase people use when they expect very little. None of them asked follow-up questions. None of them seemed curious. They had already written the story in their heads. And in their version, I was still struggling. Still trying. Still falling behind. Later that evening, I found myself standing near the vineyard with a glass of sparkling water. The cool evening breeze felt refreshing. Then I heard laughter behind me. A familiar group. Ethan. Tyler. A few cousins. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But I couldn't help hearing them. Claire seems exactly the same, Tyler said. Several people chuckled. Maybe a little older. More laughter. Ethan shrugged. Honestly, I thought she'd be working for some corporation by now. Apparently she's still doing her consulting thing. Someone laughed. What exactly does she even consult on? Good question. The group laughed again. I stood quietly. Years ago, hearing that conversation would have devastated me. Now it simply felt strange. Because every person standing there was discussing a version of me that no longer existed. They were commenting on a character from an old chapter. A chapter one had already finished. The most awkward moment came during dinner. I found myself seated directly across from Uncle Richard. The universe clearly had a sense of humor. For a while, the conversation remained pleasant. Wedding plans. Travel stories. Family updates. Then Richard looked at me. Claire. I smiled. Uncle Richard. He took a sip of wine. So tell me. Several relatives immediately became interested. I almost laughed. Some things never changed. How's business? It's good. He nodded. Good enough to pay the bills. A few people smiled. The old joke. The familiar jab. I simply answered. Yes. Richard leaned back. Well, that's something. The table laughed softly. Then he added. You always were persistent. Persistent. Not successful. Not accomplished. Persistent. As if I were still fighting to stay afloat. As if I hadn't spent years building something valuable. As if I needed his approval to validate my life. I simply smiled. Thank you. That seemed to confuse him. He was expecting defensiveness. Embarrassment. Something. Instead, I gave him nothing. As the evening continued, I noticed something fascinating. Nobody asked detailed questions. Nobody wanted specifics. Nobody investigated. Why? Because they assumed they already knew the answers. In their minds, success left clues. Luxury watches, designer clothing, boasting, status symbols. I wasn't displaying any of those things. I wore a simple elegant dress, a modest necklace. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to impress. Because I wasn't trying to prove anything. As a result, nobody suspected anything. Not Ethan. Not Vanessa. Not Tyler. Not even Uncle Richard. They all looked at me and saw exactly what they expected to see. The struggling cousin. The forgotten cousin. The harmless cousin. The family disappointment. And honestly, it was almost impressive how wrong they were. Later that night, I stepped onto a quiet balcony overlooking the vineyards. The wedding festivities continued below. Music. Laughter. Conversations. Family. For a moment, I stood alone under the stars. Thinking. Reflecting. Observing. 3 years earlier, I would have spent this entire evening trying to impress people. Trying to defend my choices. Trying to prove I deserved a seat at the table. Now I felt completely different. Calm. Comfortable. Certain. Not because of money. Because of confidence. The kind that comes from surviving difficult years. The kind that doesn't need validation. Inside the resort, my relatives continued making assumptions. They believed they understood my life. They believed nothing had changed. They believed I was still exactly where they left me years ago. What none of them realized was that by this time tomorrow, that illusion would completely collapse. And the first crack in that illusion was about to appear from the most unexpected source imaginable. The next morning, Napa Valley looked even more beautiful than it had the day before. Sunlight stretched across the vineyards. Guests wandered between the cottages with coffee cups in hand. Wedding preparations were already underway. Everything felt peaceful. At least on the surface. What nobody knew was that before the day ended, a secret I had kept hidden for years would finally be exposed. And it would happen completely by accident. The wedding ceremony wasn't scheduled until late afternoon. To keep guests entertained, Tyler and his fiancée had arranged several activities throughout the day. Wine tastings. Brunch. Guided tours. A private luncheon for family members. I attended the luncheon mostly because my mother asked me to. About 30 relatives gathered inside a large private dining room overlooking the vineyards. The atmosphere was relaxed. People chatted casually. For once, nobody seemed interested in discussing my career. I considered that a blessing. Then everything changed. It started with Ethan. Of all people. My cousin was sitting a few tables away scrolling through his phone while waiting for lunch to be served. A few minutes earlier, someone had mentioned that business consulting had become a booming industry. That led to a discussion about leadership articles and industry publications. Ethan, being Ethan, immediately pulled out his phone. I read an interesting article about operations consulting last month. Nobody paid much attention. Conversations continued around the room. Then suddenly Ethan frowned. He looked closer at his screen. Then even closer. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. The expression on his face changed. Confusion. Surprise. Disbelief. He looked across the room directly at me. Then back at the screen. Then back at me again. I knew exactly what had happened. Because I recognized the article. About 6 months earlier, a national business publication had featured a story about several consultants helping mid-sized companies improve operations during rapid expansion. One of those consultants was me. The article included my photograph. My company. Several client success stories. and a brief mention of a major multi-million-dollar acquisition involving one of the businesses I had helped scale. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Apparently Ethan had just discovered it. The room grew quieter. "Wait a second." Ethan's voice cut through the conversations. Several relatives looked toward him. He stood slowly, still staring at his phone. "Claire." Every head turned toward me. I set down my coffee cup. "Yes." Ethan looked genuinely confused. "Is this you?" The room fell silent. He turned the screen around. Several relatives leaned forward. Others stood up. I recognized the article immediately. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa grabbed her phone. "What article?" Ethan showed her. Her eyes widened. "No way." A few relatives moved closer. Within seconds, people began reading over each other's shoulders. Whispers spread across the room. Then the whispers became conversations. Then the conversations became stunned silence. I watched it happen in real time. One relative after another discovering the truth. Not the version of me they had created. The real version. The woman they hadn't bothered to learn about. The woman they had underestimated for years. The woman who had quietly built a successful consulting company while they weren't paying attention. Someone read part of the article aloud. Mitchell Consulting Solutions has helped generate operational improvements for companies valued at over $200 million. The room became even quieter. Another cousin blinked. 200 million. A third relative looked shocked. "Wait. This is Claire's company." Nobody seemed capable of processing the information. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. One of Tyler's friends searched my company online. A few seconds later his eyes widened. "You've got to be kidding me." He turned the laptop screen toward the table. My company website filled the display. Client testimonials. Industry awards. Speaking engagements. Corporate partnerships. National recognition. Years of work suddenly visible with a few clicks. The room erupted into whispers. People who had ignored me for years suddenly couldn't stop staring. The most satisfying part wasn't their shock. It was Uncle Richard's reaction. For the first time in my life, he looked completely speechless. No jokes. No clever comments. No sarcastic observations. Just silence. The man who always seemed to have something to say couldn't find a single word. He stared at the screen. Then at me. Then back at the screen. As though he was trying to solve a puzzle. The answer was simple. He had spent years assuming he knew who I was. And he had been wrong. Tyler finally broke the silence. "Claire." His voice sounded different now. Almost cautious. "Why didn't you tell anybody?" I smiled. Because the answer was surprisingly simple. I never thought anyone was interested. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a joke. Nobody had a response. Because they all knew it was true. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Just 24 hours earlier, I had been the cousin everyone overlooked. The struggling consultant. The family disappointment. Now people stared at me as though they were meeting me for the first time. And in many ways, they were. The truth had finally entered the room. And once it did, there was no putting it back. But the discovery itself wasn't the most satisfying part. What happened next would be even more surprising. Because the same relatives who had spent years mocking me were about to start treating me very differently. The rest of the luncheon felt surreal. Only an hour earlier, I had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room, largely ignored by most of my relatives. Now I couldn't walk 3 feet without someone stopping me. the transformation was almost instant. And honestly, it was uncomfortable. Not because people were suddenly being rude. Because they were suddenly being nice. Very nice. A little too nice. The first person to approach me was Tyler. The same cousin who had spent years laughing whenever Uncle Richard made jokes about my career. He walked over carrying a nervous smile. "Claire, I had no idea." I smiled politely. "Apparently." He laughed awkwardly. "Seriously though, that's incredible." There was an uncomfortable pause. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "So, how did you do it?" For years, nobody had asked that question. Nobody cared how I spent my evenings. Nobody cared about the sacrifices. Nobody cared about the failures. Now suddenly everyone wanted the story. I gave him a simple answer. One day at a time. He nodded slowly. As if he expected some secret formula. There wasn't one. Just years of work nobody bothered to notice. Within the next hour, several cousins approached me. One after another. Almost like they had formed a line. Vanessa wanted advice about improving operations in one of her real estate businesses. Another cousin wanted recommendations about consulting. Someone else asked about investing. Another wanted help with a startup idea. The same people who once treated my career as a joke were now treating me like an expert. The irony wasn't lost on me. The funniest moment happened during the cocktail reception before the wedding. I was standing near one of the vineyard terraces when Ethan approached. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Almost intimidated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. Then lowered his voice. "My firm has been dealing with some operational challenges." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because years earlier, Ethan had questioned whether my career had any growth potential. Now he was asking for professional advice. Life has a strange sense of humor. I answered his questions honestly. No sarcasm. No revenge. No scorekeeping. Just a conversation. When we finished, Ethan shook his head. "I really underestimated you." The honesty caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I simply replied. "You're not the only one." But the most interesting reaction belonged to Uncle Richard. Throughout the afternoon, he became unusually quiet. People who knew him well noticed immediately. This was a man who loved being the center of attention. A man who always had an opinion. A joke. A story. A comment. Now he seemed strangely uncomfortable. At dinner, he spoke less than anyone. Several times I caught him looking in my direction. Then quickly looking away. Almost as though he didn't know how to interact with me anymore. The power dynamic that had existed for decades had suddenly disappeared. Not because I had become more important. Because the assumptions had collapsed. And without those assumptions, Richard wasn't quite sure who he was talking to. Later that evening, fate seated us next to each other during the wedding reception. For several minutes neither of us said much. Then Richard cleared his throat. "Claire." I looked at him. For the first time in my life, he seemed nervous. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air. I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. Richard continued. "I made a lot of assumptions over the years." The nearby conversation faded into the background. I listened quietly. "I thought I understood you." He shook his head. Clearly, I didn't. For a man like Richard, that was probably the closest thing to a public confession. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Because it had taken decades for him to realize something that should have been obvious. People are more than the labels we give them. As the evening continued, I noticed a pattern. Every conversation eventually reached the same conclusion. Not about my success. About their mistake. People weren't shocked because I had built a successful company. They were shocked because they had completely misjudged me. For years, they assumed quiet meant unambitious. They assumed modest meant unsuccessful. They assumed invisible meant unimportant. And now they were being forced to confront those assumptions. One by one. Near the end of the reception, I stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the vineyard. The celebration continued behind me. Music. Laughter. Dancing. Family. A few minutes later, my mother joined me. She leaned against the railing beside me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she smiled. "They finally see you." I looked across the dark valley. The lights from the wedding glowed behind us. After a long silence, I answered, "No." She looked confused. I smiled softly. "They're finally seeing who I've been all along." My mother smiled. And for the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. The people who once mocked me had finally realized their mistake. But something even more important had happened. I had stopped needing them to realize it. And that made all the difference. The wedding ended the way most weddings do. With music. Laughter. Photographs. Tears. And promises about seeing each other more often. But as I packed my suitcase the next morning, I knew something had changed forever. Not in my family. In me. Years earlier, I would have left Napa Valley feeling victorious. I would have replayed every stunned expression. Every apology. Every awkward conversation. Every moment when people finally realized how wrong they had been. But that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was something much quieter. Something much more important. On the flight home, I looked out the window as the vineyards disappeared beneath the clouds. For a long time, I thought about the woman I used to be. The Claire who sat silently through family dinners. The Claire who dreaded holidays. The Claire who measured her worth by other people's opinions. I felt compassion for her. Because she had spent so much of her life trying to earn a place she already deserved. Trying to convince people she mattered. Trying to prove she was enough. The truth was, she had always been enough. She just didn't know it yet. When I arrived home, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Peaceful. Mine. I set down my suitcase and walked into my home office. The room wasn't particularly impressive. A desk. A bookshelf. A few framed certificates. Nothing extraordinary. Yet standing there, I felt a deeper sense of pride than any luxury mansion could have given me. Because every inch of that room represented persistence. Every achievement had been built during nights when nobody believed in me. Every success had grown from failures nobody witnessed. Every opportunity had been earned one difficult day at a time. There had been no shortcuts. No wealthy relatives opening doors. No lucky breaks that solved everything overnight. Just years of refusing to quit. A few weeks later, life returned to normal. Clients called. Projects continued. Meetings filled my calendar. The wedding slowly became another memory. Yet something unexpected happened. Family members started reaching out. Not because they needed money. Not because they wanted favors. Because they wanted a relationship. Real conversations replaced shallow ones. Some relatives apologized. Others admitted they had been wrong. A few never said anything directly, but their behavior changed. That was enough. People can learn. Sometimes it just takes longer than we expect. One evening, months later, I found myself reading through an old journal. The same one I had written in years before. The pages were filled with doubts, fears, frustrations, dreams. Then I found that sentence again. The one I had written after Thanksgiving all those years ago. One day, I want to be proud of myself, even if nobody else is. I smiled. Because now I understood something I hadn't understood back then. Success isn't the moment people finally recognize your value. Success is recognizing your own value long before they do. For most of my life, I believed the goal was proving my relatives wrong. I thought the happy ending would be watching them realize their mistake. I thought success would feel like revenge. I was wrong. The real victory wasn't the contracts. It wasn't the business. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the respect I eventually received. The real victory happened years earlier. The day I stopped asking permission to believe in myself. The day I stopped chasing approval. The day I decided my future would no longer be defined by other people's expectations. That was the moment my life truly changed. Everything else simply followed. Today, when people ask about my success, they usually expect a business lesson. A strategy. A secret. A shortcut. I always give them the same answer. Success begins the moment you stop allowing other people to decide who you are. Because the people who underestimate you are often limited by their imagination, not by your potential. And sometimes the person standing in the way of your future isn't your critic. It's the version of yourself that still believes them. My rich relatives spent years mocking me at every family gathering. They laughed at my career, questioned my ambitions, and assumed they knew exactly how my story would end. But they never saw the late nights. They never saw the sacrifices. They never saw the failures. And they certainly never saw the woman I was becoming. By the time they finally learned who I had become, I no longer needed their approval. And that's why, in the end, the greatest achievement wasn't building a successful business. It was building a life that made me proud when nobody was watching. Because money can change your circumstances. Recognition can change how others see you. But self-respect changes everything. And once you have that, nobody can take it away.